Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Juliet, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Before I pass it over to Patrick, our speaker, let me cover a few housekeeping items. At the top of your screen are multiple engagement tools you can use. All tools are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can expand your presentation area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. Now, if you have any audio or video issues, you should be able to find the answers located in the Help widget at the top of your screen. Please note that a copy of today's slide deck and additional resources are available in the resource list. Have a look and download everything that you may find useful. Also, this webinar will be recorded and sent via the email you register with. Lastly, if you have any questions during the presentation, you can submit them through the Q&A widget. We're here to answer you live via the chat, so don't hesitate to reach out throughout the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Today, we're joined by Patrick Knowles, our manager of A&D solutions here at Jama Software, where he empowers a diverse portfolio of clients to achieve their strategic objectives. Patrick is a systems engineering and project management expert with deep experience in the aerospace and defense industry. He helps clients optimize their systems engineering and requirements management processes using Jama Connect. With a background in developing and building missiles, software, and commercial space products, Patrick brings practical insight and proven strategies to teams working towards innovation, compliance, and operational excellence. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Patrick, to kick us off.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm excited to be here with you all and discuss something near and dear to my engineering heart. No matter what company, team, or project I've worked on, making sure information is reviewed effectively and ready for development has always been critical. This concept of multi-phase reviews within the system development lifecycle is a pertinent topic no matter where your team finds themselves within the lifecycle, whether it's early on or if it's late in the cycle. As we continue today, I really hope to illustrate practical examples as well as tangible solutions to this complex topic. Our agenda today will cover the what, why, and how of multi-phase reviews. Additionally, I will demonstrate how user-friendly these reviews can be, as well as how accessible the data can be to users within a tool like Jama Connect. Our first topic will be centered around what really is a multi-phase review, right? We're going to look at the definition, we're going to look at some of the causality of it. We will then progress to understanding why these multi-phase reviews are both necessary and important, whether it's standards and regulations requiring them or other reasons. This will then lead us into a discussion on how to implement them in Jama Connect and how that might improve, all sorts of personas and people who operate within the tool, from engineering to program management, and improve their ability to simply understand where the data is in the design cycle. Finally, I'll do some demonstration on the functionality live in the tool so we can truly see how effective this can be. But the first things first, what really is this concept of multi-phase review and how does it differ from what we'll call kind of the norm or, standard workflows and other processes? By definition, a multi-phase review is a series or set of reviews throughout the stages of a product's life cycle. These reviews are purpose-built to ensure that the data under review is effectively agreed to and approved by relevant stakeholders. The good news is we're all super familiar with these multi-phase reviews, even though the term might be new. Nearly every engineering organization and every engineering review that exists leads to another review or is the gate to a new stage that includes more reviews. That, as a premise, is multi-phase reviews in a nutshell. This then can manifest itself into the most macro life cycle approaches, like your system requirement review, moving to preliminary design review, and then on to critical design review. or even down into your more micro individual requirement approvals and then their associated verification closures after a verification or test event. Think something like test readiness review and then a closing review after the test is complete. I want to discuss all of this in greater detail to ensure we are all on the same page before proceeding to explaining why it is powerful and important to effectively manage these types of reviews. I want to narrow in on those two examples I provided so far, the system requirements review and the preliminary design review and so on, as well as the requirement and verification approach. Of course, there is the third example listed on the screen, and there are many, many more examples out there that bring up the core tenets of a multi-phase review. The potentially most common example is that macro product lifecycle example where you're going from system requirement review and so on into another review. Engineers typically utilize this in one fashion or another, even if you don't call it these different stages. Teams typically progress from system requirements review to a preliminary design review, and then to their all important critical design review, which means, you're ready to cut metal, you're ready to really get into that final stage of development. At each stage, engineers review requirements inside and out. But many times, teams are kind of unable to adequately display if each individual requirement or related artifact is approved at each of these stages on its own. This is just a little bit of foreshadowing for later in this conversation where I explain the benefits of managing a multi-phase review or just in general this multi-phase review approach. Standard reviews are siloed and individual, and they don't follow some greater master plan, whereas a multi-phase review in this context will follow some greater plan where the data is always displayed and users are always right at their fingertips able to understand what's going on. Additionally, teams may run into the multi-phase review approach when approving requirements kind of just in general, where they likely will proceed through verification events and finally return to confirm that the requirement was adequately satisfied by the verification event. And there's going to be a number of steps in there from requirement is approved to verification is approved to verification is live and being run and executed. And then finally, that last piece that I kind of illustrated just a moment ago, where you approve that the verification itself met the needs of the requirement. Even if it was completed the way that the steps are written, you still need to validate and verify that it is truly meeting the needs. In scenarios like this, the phase might be spread out, but nonetheless, it is pertinent to the engineer designing the system that the requirement is approved. The verification expert and that verification needs to be completed, and they need to understand that, and they expect to be able to understand that. And then the system thinker, who sees both the requirement and the verification, as well as the rest of the system, wants to see that all of that is coming together harmoniously to generate an effectively engineered product. Everything we just discussed is kind of the core of the purpose of a multi-phase review and managing these. But let's get more into the granular details of why a team might consider this type of approach and this very proactive style of approach, and some of the benefits of effectively tracking and managing this type of review process. So, why, right? That is the best question to ask. And we can ask ourselves a couple times to get down to an answer here. After all, many of us are very, very familiar with these larger processes. We see these documents get delivered at each of these major life cycle milestones. We participate in different reviews already, actively within our teams. However, the data isn't always there and it's not always being displayed the best it can be. And really, why are we doing these reviews in the first place if we're also familiar with them? For most, it is a mandate from some, higher power. Those sources might be any number of things, and I've got a couple of them listed here on the screen. The most common is standards and regulations. Standards, process improvement initiatives, desires for transparency, along with just general principles of project management, will all play into this. But standards and regulations are going to be the most detailed and typical process guidance that we have with respect to reviews. Teams are always, of course, looking for ways to improve on current processes, even when the standard says that they have to do it. They want to make it the fastest, the cleanest, the best. In fact, this whole conversation is centered around improving the concept and workflow of your standard review processes, right? That's why we have this term multi-phase review and why it's going to be important to understand how we can utilize a multi-phase review for extra clarity during the progress of all processes. That clarity, of course, increases transparency, in turn, allowing engineering teams to have full ownership of their requirements, and then really enabling that ability for teams to go work with confidence. All of this increases the ability to be flexible as well, especially with respect to project management processes. Your multi-phase review can occur all together, like a system requirement review or preliminary design review, or they can occur iteratively, like those individual or maybe small groups of requirements that have just been verified and things of that nature. With all this said, the short answer to why is that many of our requirements for reviews lie in standards and regulations. So let's talk a little bit about those. Each and every one of these documents listed require teams to create some form of auditable review process for their requirements, some more stringent than other. So, in short, are reviews required? Yes, most certainly. Now, nearly none of these documents explain exactly how to tackle the review process and how to manage them. And so that's where this conversation really starts to get its wings, especially when we're contrasting it to maybe a standard review process, which is very item focused. Is this requirement approved? Has this requirement gone through this stage, and so on and so forth? And you might kind of have a single track process. So, that standard approach versus the multi-phase approach, let's talk about some of the pros and cons here and why adding a little bit of complexity to your underlying metadata in a tool and enabling a multi-phase review improves against the standard workflow kind of approach. Many times in the world of engineering and data management, teams will develop a workflow or a step-by-step process that data items progress through. These straightforward workflows enable clear paths for victory, except when the thing they're enabling isn't clear to understand. Unfortunately, many times it's complicated to manage a single path to the finish line. A true multi-phase review pieces these parts out and allows team to manage more down and in and simply per stage or phase of the review. No longer will an item that was identified as approved and has a field that says it's approved move to under review. It will stay in that approved state unless there's truly a change to that data item. It's going to then progress through the next gate through a different field showing a different status and showing, what percentage along the way it is to the completion of stage 2. So the requirement at the system requirements review has been approved. And then at that preliminary design review, we'll see whether or not that item has made it through all its checklists, has been reviewed by all the right people, and what percentage of the way it is to completion of preliminary design review. All of this is going to help teams have data right at their fingertips. In a properly managed multi-phase review, in fact, the data can be so accessible that auditing said status drastically simplifies and teams are much more content and understanding of where their data is. This is all due to the transparency that increases when you enable and manage proactively a multi-phase review. This increase in transparency leads to visibility at all stages in the process, ownership being easier to take a hold of, and flexibility for when the process needs to change. During my time in industry, That last point was always critical. Sometimes the one size fit all method doesn't work for a team. In those instances, program leaders want teams to know how the process has changed, and those teams are then responsible for completing the work as expected. This can be challenging to do without the right framework in place for multi-phase reviews. As a short and small example, before we get into implementing and understanding how this all works, consider a fast-paced team. They would like to take on the review processes that have been approved by the company, but they're moving so quickly that they would like to skip the proceedings of something like preliminary design review. They're not going to skip the end all be all gate of critical design review. They want to jump straight there from that system requirement review. Now imagine for a moment that all you need to do to indicate this to every person on the team who's touching requirements is remove one field from your requirement item type. Suddenly the process is greatly simplified. Suddenly you no longer see that required step and you know you're progressing towards the next step in the list. Or if you will, imagine a team that maybe didn't do a great job at their critical design review and they need a delta critical design review because the proceedings of the original review were simply not up to par or the customer wasn't as clear as they needed to be and they've come to this place of ambiguity and want to re-review some of the data. Again, it can be as simple as adding a new field instead of removing one to that requirement item type and beginning to track the progress from 0 to 100% on that item. Now, of course, I'm marginally simplifying the conversation with those last two examples. However, the concept of just removing or adding a field is essentially all that stands in the way of implementing a fantastic, proactive, multi-phase review within Jama Connect. So what do you really need to enable within the tool? Well, it comes down to three critical aspects within this approach. Unique item types for each phase of the review, roll-up fields that indicate the status of each phase of the review per requirement, and utilizing workflow automations and the Jama Connect Review Center to track signatures and phase progress. Teams that are ready to enable multi-phase reviews will create item types that house the rationale for each phase closure, right? Think of verification closure record, which is why we have verification closure status there in the middle of the screen. These items will include workflow automations that when they are reviewed and approved, they automatically populate status on their related requirements. And then this in turn puts all the data right in front of the teams, developing whatever product or good the team is working